My current research project engages with the essay film, but moving beyond the debate of the past few years, which predominantly has focused on the definition of the form, variously identified with a series of features such as the expression of a subjective viewpoint, the presence of a sustained critical engagement, the mix of fact and fiction, the dialogue with the spectator, and the adoption of a reflexive voiceover. The essay film, however, continues to be an elusive and challenging form that defies definition, and so this debate, in my view, has now reached a standstill, which I propose to overcome by asking no longer what an essay film is, but what it does and where it does it. I argue that the essay film's most significant gesture is that of placing itself in in-between positions in relation to genres, formats, languages, materials, and technologies, and of articulating its thinking in interstices. Adopting Gilles Deleuze's definition of interstice as a differentiation of potential between two incommensurable elements, which radically calls the image into question and produces something new, my project explores essayistic in-betweenness in various filmic dimensions, including medium, genre, and temporality, and in linguistic codes such as image, editing, framing, and sound. Today, I will focus on genre. The essay film is the cinematic evolution of the 400-year-old tradition of the literary essay. A widely acknowledged feature of the literary essay, and by extension of the essay film, is its resistance to classification, as we just discussed. Essays do not obey the laws of any genre, an attitude succinctly captured by Adorno's famous claim that the essay's innermost formal law is heresy. Other theorists and critics have reiterated the concept in similar ways. The essay does not obey any rules, therefore it is not a genre, as it strives to be beyond formal, conceptual, and social constraint, or even more radically, it is a non-genre. However, no text exists in a void, and even the heretical essay is in debt with a number of traditions. Paul Arthur, for instance, has usefully described the essay film as a meeting ground for documentary, avant-garde, and art film impulses. The expression meeting ground suggests a fluid positioning, one that is at once relative and relational vis-à-vis fixed position. While I acknowledge, as all critics do, that the essay film is heretical with respect to genres, I claim it chooses an in-between positioning as a specific purpose, that of creating interstices from within which to query generic conventions and their ideological underpinnings. The essay's in-betweenness draws specific attention to the boundaries of genre and to the specificities of generic conventions and challenges them. As such, I claim the argument of the essay film is always also an argument on genre. The genre I will address as a case study today is ethnographic cinema. My argument is based on an examination of landscape as a genre-specific rhetorical construct that some essay films expose and deconstruct in order to deliver a critique of ethnography and of its ideological underpinnings. First, however, I will establish the features of the ethno-landscape as a framing device. I make recourse to the neologism ethno-landscape to highlight that the landscape of ethnography is a specific discourse based on conventions which, first defined through the practice of ethnographic writing, developed in distinct ways through the genres of ethnographic photography and film. With ethnographic film in particular, I refer to a mainstream tradition, so not to the experimental side of it, to a mainstream tradition of filmic documentation of predominantly non-Western cultures, especially those perceived to be primitive, exotic, and endangered, which has produced a specific ethnographic gaze projected onto a racialized other. My premise is that what we broadly intend with ethnography is a discourse that necessitates a framing device. In order to be understood as ethnography, a discourse on the other has to be framed as such. It must take place within an ethnographic space as defined by the Western imagination and by the tenets of ethnography as a Western science. The framing becomes entirely evident, for instance, in the case of the exhibition of artifacts in the authenticating spaces of the museum, an apparatus and a structure that qualifies things as cultural and or artistic objects. It is this framing effect that was at once exploited and highlighted by Guillermo Gomes Peña and Coco Fusco in their famous The Couple in the Cage performance, which toured various museums across Europe and North America in 1992-93, and in which they presented themselves as Amerindians from Gatineau, an hitherto undiscovered island in the Gulf of Mexico. You can imagine with what results. But the ethnographic museum shares, of course, the same DNA as ethnographic film, as Fatima Tobironi did not omit to emphasize in her study of cinema as the ethnographic spectacle. At the height of the age of imperialism during the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States and Europe, there was a tremendous proliferation in new popular science entertainments visualizing the ethnographic, such as dioramas and bone collections of the Natural History Museum, the exhibited native villages of the warfare and the zoo, printed representations such as the postcard and stereograph or carte de visite, popular science journals such as National Geographic, and, of course, photography and cinema. In fact, ethnographic film can be seen as an extension of the museum as an early 20th century scientific practice. The first anthropologists who used film in the field studied humans rather as zoological specimens. As Ella Shohat and Robert Stam confirm in their influential study of multiculturalism in the media, cinema, in this sense, prolonged the museological project of gathering three-dimensional archaeological, ethnographic, botanical, and zoological objects in the metropolis. Hence, ethnographic film can be said to adapt the framing devices that had already been established by the Natural History Museum and by the ethnographic writing. For instance, a recurrent parallel gesture of both ethnographic writing and film is the travelogue trope of the panoramic view, the monarch of all I survey view, in the words of Mary Louise Pratt, used to present discovery scenes, which helped ground the representation of travel as penetration and discovery of a landscape. The trope of the panoramic view or shot taken from the perspective of the traveler contributes to the production of an ethnographic space, one that was clearly shaped by Western discourses. The effects of this trope on the reader and spectator are tangible. As Bill Nichols writes, the arrival scene, I'm quoting Bill Nichols here, the arrival scene and the distance required by the act of representation confirms the sense of otherness, strangeness, end of quote. By the way, the filmmakers of King Kong, as probably everybody knows, were ethnographers before making King Kong. The ethno-landscape is the requisite framing device for filmed ethnography. I claim that we first recognize and identify filmed ethnography through our recognition of landscape as the product of a specific gaze stemming from art, science, and popular entertainment traditions that combine spectacle, power, and ideology. It matters that the genre of landscape itself was born as a framing device. The invention of Western landscape coincides with the production of the vista, a space that is internal to the painting but opens it to the exterior. It is the discovery of an adequate technique of framing and definition of depth that marks the invention of landscape as cultural space visible in all its aspects. While entirely inside, the landscape as an ethnographic discourse and frame is also invisible, and not only because, as Derrida has posited in the Parergon, a frame is a form which has traditionally been determined not by distinguishing itself, but by disappearing, sinking in, obliterating itself, dissolving, just as it expends its greatest energy. The natural space of the landscape is given as a natural fact as well as a frame, and is offered to the Western eye via a regime of authenticity historically linked first to discourses of exploration and discovery, and then to the myth of the fieldwork as it became constituted in the 1920s. James Duncan proposes that two sets of rhetorical tropes are especially important in the representation of places within discourses of the racialized other. The first is tropes of mimesis, which persuasively claim to represent accurately and objectively the nature of a place, and are based on motifs of physical presence and expertise, the expertise of the ethnographer. The tropes of the second set present the real world of geographical difference and temporal co-presence as two distinct worlds which occupy different spaces and temporalities. In this sense, the representation tends to present the racialized other and his or her environment as the past of Europe. I mean, they coexist, but they are represented almost as the past of Europe. Produced by these practices, the ethno-landscape is at once productive, namely of an ethnographic subject. This is compellingly captured by Roni as she describes her own experience as a spectator, watching from the outside, almost with the third eye, the encounter between the white explorer and the Islander savage in King Kong. As she writes, "With another eye, I see how I am pictured as a landscape, a museum display, an ethnographic spectacle, an exotic. The ethnographic subject is pictured as a landscape, which is itself at once framing device and part of the picture, scientific display, and exotic spectacle." My case studies today are three essays which position themselves in a generic in-betweenness with respect to ethnography. And these are Luis Buñuel's Las Hurdes, Werner Herzog's Fata Morgana, and Ben Rivers' Slow Action. While separated by almost 40 years, Las Hurdes and Fata Morgana will be discussed together, for landscape is similarly strategic to their statements on ethnography. On account of its profilmic material presence, nature is offered by Buñuel and Herzog as an element of authenticity, but also as a charged discourse which at once conceals and discloses the constructedness of the ethnographic film's gaze on nature and people. Las Hurdes positions itself between ethnography and surrealism, Fata Morgana between ethnography, surrealism, and science fiction. It is important to note how temporally close Las Hurdes was to the establishment of the authority of the ethnographer. And I'm quoting, in the 1920s, the new fieldworker theories brought to completion a powerful new scientific and literary genre, the ethnography, a synthetic cultural description based on participant observation. In this new genre, culture was construed as an ensemble of characteristic behaviors, ceremonies, and gestures susceptible to recording and explanation by a trained onlooker. Las Hurdes mimics the newly established genre, to which it was close in more than one way, if we consider that ethnography and surrealism developed in close proximity in the 1920s and in the 1930s. Las Hurdes prepares our encounter with the eponymous region through a series of devices adapted to produce an ethno-landscape. We start with a number of captions announcing that, in the opinion of geographers and travelers, the region we will visit is inhospitable and was unknown even to the same Spaniards until 1922. We are then shown a map of Europe, a contrivance typical of both fictions and documentaries, which gestures towards myths of scientific objectivity and expertise, as well as the imperialist imagination. The map suggests the mastery of space from above, precisely like the vista, the panoramic view so common to both ethnographic writing and film. And I would like now to show you a short clip from the beginning of Buñuel's film.
En divers lieux d'Europe, il existe des pays dont la civilisation est des plus arriérées. En Espagne, à 100 km de Salamanque, foyer de haute culture, se trouvent les Urdes. Elles sont isolées du monde extérieur par de hautes montagnes difficilement accessibles, couvertes de bruyères et de scystes. Avant d'arriver aux Urdes, nous devons passer par la Alberca, village assez riche, de caractère féodal, qui a une grande influence sur la vie des Urdes, dont presque tous les habitants sont tributaires. Voici l'église de la Alberca. Deux têtes de mort dans leur niche semblent présider aux destinées du village. Les maisons ont généralement 3 étages et leur architecture est peu fréquente en Espagne. Elles donnent aux rues un aspect moyenâgeux. Les maisons, pour la plupart, portent gravée au-dessus de la porte une inscription religieuse « Ave Maria, l'Immaculée qui a conçu sans péché ». Le jour de notre arrivée, nous voyons les femmes du village en train de se peigner. Elles sont habillées de leurs plus beaux vêtements. Nous leur demandons pourquoi elles font toilette. Elles nous répondent qu'il faut que nous allions sur la place de l'église où l'on va célébrer comme chaque année une fête étrange et barbare.
Okay. I'm sure you're familiar with the film anyway, but Sébastien Cacard has argued that contemporary digital cartography, I think this is a very interesting argument, so the contemporary digital cartography was originally conceptualized in films, and in particular in the cinematographic animated map, whose first emergence he traces in docudramas of the 1910s. While the map in Buñuel's film is not literally animated, animation is suggested by a series of dissolves that mobilize the image and change the view from the broad continental perspective to a national and then a local one. As Cacard has argued, this type of map has 2 functions, a narrative one, for it increases the dramatic tension, as well as it provides narrative transitions, and an authenticating one, for it reinforces the veracity of documentary discourse by grounding it in existing places and establishing a fallacious authenticity of a place. As well as authenticating the documentary on Las Urdes, the map has the estranging and subversive effect of likening Europe to an exotic land. Captions and map introduce the two sets of rhetorical tropes that, according to James Duncan, as we have already seen, are key to the racialized representation of places. While they fallaciously promise an accurate and objective representation, the voiceover presents the racialized other as the past of Europe, when it says that in some European locations there exist enclaves of quasi-Paleolithic civilization. What is subversive about this representation is, of course, that it undermines Europe's view of itself as the highly civilized, developed, modern continent that defines itself in contrast to a retrograde, prehistoric, exotic, faraway other. An episode set in the pueblo of La Alberca is a further device used to manufacture Las Urdes as ethno-landscape. La Alberca in Buñuel's film is placed midway between civilization and the quasi-Paleolithic Las Urdes. Here we are shown, as we saw, a strange and barbaric annual festival during which all men who recently married must detach with their bare hands the head of a cock suspended over their heads while riding on horseback. Commenting on the Catholic pendants decorating a baby's garments, then, the voiceover notes that they are reminiscent of, and I'm quoting, the amulets of savage peoples of Africa and Oceania. Ready by now to encounter an exotic, barbaric, primitive, racialized other, we are finally offered the first view of Las Urdes, a sweeping panoramic shot from the top of the mountains. The mountainous landscape frames the whole section of the film set in Las Urdes. The rhythm is dictated by the alternation of scenes set in the village and on the mountains, and the vista from the mountain top returns again during the episode and closes the film. However, this is no paradise. The landscape of Las Urdes, while presented through the tropes of the Western discovery and conquest of an exotic panorama, subverts expectations, for it disrupts Europeans' view of themselves as civilized and progressive and turns them into ethnographic subjects. The subversion is deeply surrealist. The film presents no romantic view of the other as a more authentic or an alternative culture. The depiction is provocatively absurd, violent, and ruthless, and the attention is on Western constructs and regimenting institutions such as the Catholic Church, the school, imperialism, and capitalism, with its relentless exploitation of workers and the poor. By positioning itself in an interstice between ethnographic documentary and surrealism, the film is at once an ideological critique of Western constructs and a terrifying, macabre painting, as a critic has defined it. Released 38 years later, Werner Herzog's Fata Morgana was shot over a 13-month period in Africa. It opens with a plane landing on a runway immersed in greenery. The potential of the sequence to be read as an ethnographic arrival scene is quickly neutralized and mocked after a title announcing the first chapter of the film, entitled The Creation. Another landing is shown, and then another, for a total of 8 landings. In the first section, a voice reads passages from the sacred book of the Quiche Indians of Guatemala, Popol Vuh, about the first creation, after the failure of which the gods decided to wipe away the human race and start again. In the 2 subsequent sections, Paradise and the Golden Age, Herzog reads texts he wrote which sound like increasingly absurd parodies of Popol Vuh. Western music from various epochs is played throughout the film, subverting the discourse of primitivism evoked by the mythological text and by the visuals, including the panoramic and traveling shots of the desert, sand dunes, oases, villages, and animals. Paradox and surrealism are invoked by the contrast between what we see and what we hear. While the voice speaks of the gods giving life to animals, for example, we are shown decaying carcasses. And I want to now show you a brief excerpt from Fata Morgana.
Nur Wasser staute sich, nur das Meer lag ruhig da, eine einzige Stauung, rein nichts gab es, was etwa sonst noch gewesen wäre. Einzig allein die Erbauerin und der Schöpfer, die Mächtige und Kukumats, sie, die Gebärerin und der Söhne-Erzeuger, waren da in den unendlichen Gewässern. Nur Ruhe war und Stille in Dunkelheit und Nacht. Desgleichen war wirklich der Himmel da, war auch das Herz des Himmels da. Dies ist der Name des Gottes, so wird er genannt. Dessen Wort nun gelangte dorthin, kam zu der Mächtigen und zu Kukumats, dorthin in die Dunkelheit, in die Nacht und sprach zur Mächtigen und zu Kukumats. Und sie redeten und berieten sich, überlegten nun sorglich, verständigten sich miteinander und brachten ihre Worte und ihre Erwägung in Einklang. Da tauchte der Uranfang des Lichts. Da tauchte auch der Mensch in ihren Plänen auf. Und dann überdachten sie das Sprießen, das Werden der Bäume und Schlinggewächse, das Aufsprießen des Lebens und die Erschaffung des Menschengeschlechts in Dunkelheit und Nacht, Kraft dessen, der das Herz des Himmels und dessen Name Hurrikan ist. Blitzstrahl Hurrikan ist seine erste Erscheinung, die zweite ist dann Däumlingsblitz, die dritte endlich ist der grüne Blitz. In diesen dreien ist also das Herz des Himmels begriffen.
As we have seen, the view of landscape proposed by the film is paradoxical and surreal. While the voiceover describes an uncontaminated, primeval, empty space, the camera shows us the incongruous remnants of an industrial era scattered in the desert: rotting machines, airplane carcasses, burning oil wells, pipes, barrels, shacks. The statement is twice repeated, "There is landscape even without deeper meaning," seems to hint at the surreal subtraction of the sense from the image of an exotic environment that is framed at once as a typical ethno-landscape and as an incoherent absurdity. The absurd introduces irony as discrepancy and gap, as Jonathan Smith has remarked in an essay on representations of landscapes. In the landscape, subversion is triggered by the fleck of irony that can make farce of any represented pretension. Irony is a representational discrepancy, a symbol out of place. Irony betrays the existence of representation in the purportedly presentational and opens social convention to exploration and critique. While in the 1970s, new ethnography and ethnoscience were striving to avoid portraying abstract, ahistorical others, Herzog represents a historicized other, whose history is, however, evidently fabricated, displaced, given the Popol Vuh is Guatemalan, and incoherently primitive. The obliteration of geographical and historical specificity, coupled with the mythical framework, evokes the trope of an ethno-landscape as the past of Europe. On the other hand, Fata Morgana's critique is articulated in these interstices of genre, and in particular, the film locates itself in between ethnographic travelogue and science fiction. It must be noted that Herzog went to Africa precisely with the intention of making a science fiction film and only changed his mind on location, as he explained in interviews. My plan was to go out to the southern Sahara to shoot a kind of science fiction story about aliens from the planet Andromeda. Now, this is if we believe Herzog, but it doesn't matter. A star outside our own galaxy who arrive on a very strange planet. It is not Earth, rather some newly discovered place where the people live waiting for some imminent catastrophe, that of a collision with the sun in exactly 16 years. As Herzog points out in the same interview, Fata Morgana retains much of the original plan. I like the desolation and remains of civilization that were out there, things that added to the science fiction idea. We would find machinery lying in the middle of the desert, a cement mixer or something like that, 1,000 miles from the nearest settlement or town. You stand in front of these things and are in absolute awe. What was it, ancient astronauts who put these things down there? The science fiction discourse introduces yet another temporal layer to those of the mythical primeval past and of Africa's synchronic present. This is a time that is at once past and hyperbolically future, as if Fata Morgana's desert were located at once before and after civilization, simultaneously a primeval land and an apocalyptic post-industrial landscape. The effect is strengthened by a number of aerial shots, which could potentially provide Mary Pratt's Monarch of All Eye Survey scene, but far from conveying the domination of the landscape, these views do not shed any light on the configuration of the territory. At the opposite, they confound us by showing a land of indistinguishable features. Desert, sea, or ice, it is hard to know what we are looking at. The landscape is not transformed into a pleasing aesthetic artifact shaped by perspective artificialis and dominated by a human eye. It is an unattractive, meaningless, indistinguishable land where our sight gets lost. Ultimately, no improved knowledge, no superior ethnographic understanding of the desert is ever achieved in Fata Morgana. Also playing concepts of ethno-landscape against ideas of landscape irony, Ben Rivers' slow action has something in common with both Buñuel's and Herzog's films, while developing a distinct argument that I will read under the sign of the ruin. While being scattered like Fata Morgana with post-industrial and post-apocalyptic detritus, slow action is itself a filmic ruin, and this, I argue, is its most decisive contribution to this history of essayistic critiques of mainstream ethnography. Slow action is divided into 4 chapters, each devoted to an island, which is described by 2 dispassionate narrators, a man and a woman, like in Fata Morgana. Exhibited alternatively as a synchronous multi-screen installation piece and as a sequential film, slow action overtly pays homage to Fata Morgana, while in interviews its author has also discussed its artistic debt to Las Urdes. Chris Marker's fictional ethnographies are also of relevance here, as is an affinity with some of Peter Greenaway's early experimental films, especially his absurdist encyclopedic works, Vertical Features Remake, A Walk Through Age, and The Falls. The text, written by science fiction novelist Mark von Schlegel, constitutes the islands as post-apocalyptic utopian worlds. As River has explained, the film was intended to play with memories of ethnographic filmmaking, observing human beings for records, and turn this on its head sometimes, so that the voices do occasionally become questionable, even at the very end, first person. I wanted to give the impression that this was part of a much larger work, a great encyclopedia, that these accounts from another fading race of humans, whose utopia is a collection of other utopias, and their accounts are trying to be as neutral as possible, but there are mistakes and slippages. Of the 4 chapters, 11 was shot on the volcanic island of Lanzarote, Haiva, or also subtitled The Society Islands, on Tuvalu, a tiny Polynesian island nation, Kanzenashima on Gunkunishima, a Japanese artificial mining island, and Somerset, ironically, in the county in southwest England. And I want to show you a clip indeed from Somerset.
It is perhaps unusual to consider a civilization whose stone boulevards are lined with drains for the easy dispersal of blood a utopia, but the curator solicits such status for this island. Somerset is the common name for the largest island at the westward reaches of the proliferation of islands that arose after the Fourth Great Flood epoch. It extends from 51 minutes 26 seconds to 55 minutes 21 seconds west by Quinian's compass. It is called Somerset by default, usually going under other names, so zealous are its politicians. Historically, Somerset is distinguished by its fervent political culture. It is a civilization that can be said to exist always in a state of imminent, occurring, or just suppressed revolution. Somerset is divided territorially into one province, the Somerset Basin, and 32 promontories: Ballyhister, Van Hoe, Cavan, Milburn Port, Hippolyte, Fermanagh, Stilburn, Cannes, Hoplite, Fairport, Zeed, Frilm, Leith, Loth, Velman's Land, Cronoa, Milton, Waxford, Fenner's Freehold, Gull's Neck, Pillow, Roden, Slanland, Munster, Clearport, Kent, Gallow, Ironville, Yillix, Ulysses, John's Landing, and Indian Queens.
So, unlike Buñuel's and Herzog's films, slow action never attempts a mimetic representation of reality. The film alternates black and white and color. The image's texture is always in evidence and ever-changing. Traces and marks that seem due to the work of time and of the elements are inscribed on the surface of the film, as are the flashes that suddenly turn it to red, blue, or white. Filmed in 16mm, the different textures and marks were obtained through the hand processing of the film, but also by opening the camera's back in between shots and by including film roll beginnings or ends. These effects contribute to carve a temporal distance between the time of viewing and the perceived time of filming, which further short-circuits with the spectator's understanding of the chronology of the story. The islands appear to be in our future rather than in our past, as suggested by the science fiction motifs, such as holograms appearing in the sky, futuristic objects, and descriptions of alien-looking animals and people. And yet, the ethnographic gaze on landscapes and human beings evokes the traditional trope of primitivism, thus inscribing an archaic temporality into the film. The confusion is compounded by the multiplicity of points of view. From what historical moment and geographical position do the narrators speak? When is their narration located with respect to the histories of the islands and to the record made by the mysterious curator of the great encyclopedia? And when and why was the footage shot, and how did it reach the narrators? As Rivers said in an interview, I like to think of the films as ones that could be discovered in a dustbin in 200 years, as the last few survivors run a projector by dynamo to find out just where everything went wrong. It is the idea of the found footage that is important to highlight here, as well as that of the apocalypse. The islands are found objects. The great encyclopedia is a found object. The footage also is, as suggested by the fragmentary, incomplete nature of the film. The masks worn by the Islanders in the Somerset episode are made with found materials. The film's soundtrack is equally recycled, as all music is taken from the soundtracks of mostly science fiction films from the 1970s. The aesthetic of the found object is a ruinous one, as Catherine Russell has argued. Found footage filmmaking, otherwise known as collage, montage, or archival film practice, is an aesthetic of ruins. Its intertextuality is always also an allegory of history, a montage of memory traces, by which the filmmaker engages with the past through recall, retrieval, and recycling. While not an actual found footage film, but rather a mimicked one, slow action's collagist and recycling attitude, coupled with its post-apocalyptic motifs, suggests a crucially contemporary context of environmental decay and unsustainable economies. In addition, the original context of the film's production and exhibition places it within the phenomenon of the re-entry of 16mm film in the art gallery that has taken place since the 1990s and that Erika Balsom has proposed to read as a shift to the exploration of history and the obsolescent. Within the pristine and sanctified spaces of art, 16mm film is employed as a precious remnant of a cinema in ruins, with the film print elevated to the status of a collectible objet d'art. Unlike Las Hurdes and Fata Morgana, slow action's ruinous collage stance and decomposing quality of image and sound exclude from the start the potential for a mimetic presentation of landscape, which is now entirely beyond reach, as utopian as the islands themselves, while also clarifying that the filmic ethno-landscape was always already technologically mediated. Slow action is not nostalgic of economic and filmic imperialism, though it is nostalgic of 1970s science fiction. Its landscapes are as ironic as those in Buñuel's and Herzog's films. The irony is to be found once again in the gap between written text and image, or read text and image, in the impossible realities of science fiction, in the surreal presence on the islands, on Jaiba especially, of the waste of Western civilization. But where slow action excels is in showing that we live today in a ruinous ecology, not only of environment and culture, but also of film itself. In our post-celluloid era of perfect, unpolluted, non-indexical images, slow action is slow cinema, a layered, textured, blemished, collaged cinema that demonstrates how film's detritus, accumulated over the past century, preserves the traces of all the utopias of our culture, utopia of ethno-landscape included. As the voiceover recites during the Kanzeneshima episode, and I quote, "Utopia cannot be in the future, nor can it be known in the present. Utopia is the past, not the past as a golden age, but the past as ruins of its own ruins." As a critical discourse on genre, then, and I conclude, the essay film places itself in generic interstices. Las Hurdes, Fata Morgana, and slow action in particular are positioned not only between radically incompatible geographies and temporalities, but also between incommensurable generic conventions, between science fiction and ethnography, between documentary and fiction, between art, film, and popular entertainment traditions, between experimental cinema and parody. In so doing, they produce depictions that exploit the irony gap to reveal the constructedness of genre and of its ideological underpinnings. In particular, by attracting attention to cultural and perceptual framings, they highlight discourses of medium transparency, tropes of authenticity, primitivism, and conflicting temporalities, and the articulation of specific historicized visual regimes. While doing so, they also reflect on the film medium itself, on its participation in the shaping of an ideology of the gaze, in the cultural and technological mediation of place, and, as of today, on its own revealing anachronism. Thank you very much for listening.
I was interested in just how possible it is to widen the purpose of film. So you've selected three very interesting ones, and you've mentioned quite a bit. And so I was interested if you could talk about the selection of corpus, taking into mind the specific approach of genre.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Absolutely. I mean, I guess I should clarify that I come as I tried to explain a little bit at the beginning, I come to this topic more while thinking about, as I said, how the essay film works and how it thinks, positioning itself or creating incommensurable gaps. So I am looking at a range of different ways in which the essay film does this, and focusing then on genre. I came to select this particular topic. Frankly, I can't remember even how I stumbled on this idea of the ethno-landscape and thinking about this sort of in-between generic positioning. The corpus is perhaps, could certainly be broadened. I mean, Chris Marker is a filmmaker that I wanted to originally include, and some of the films like Letter from Siberia, for instance, even Sans Soleil itself. So films that play with the concept of doing an ethnography, but you know, sort of so reproducing certain tropes of ethnography, but then, you know, placing themselves in between other genres as well. So Chris Marker is an obvious candidate. I sort of stopped, you know, after a while looking for films, but there was another film that I would have loved to see, and I apologize because I can't remember the exactly, you know, the title, etc. But it was a German film of which I read about, and some of you may know and help me to identify it. Which creates an ethnographic look of a jungle. But by the end of the film, you discover that you are in the garden of the filmmaker. So it's a kind of a backyard ethnography, so there are films, you know, that sort of other films that could be brought in, but I'm not so much suggesting that there is a whole genre. I don't want to create a genre, and I don't want to, in a sense, even talk about the essay film as a genre. What I want to do is talk about how the essay film works and how it thinks. And it does strike me, however, that because it places itself always, because it challenges genre and you know, generic belonging, and it tests those boundaries, it is a discourse on genre, and that is probably why we find it so difficult to pin it down, because it's constantly thinking about a range of things, including genre and what genre is. So this is not an attempt at creating a new genre, or even as, you know, sort of bottling the essay film into a particular box. It's just an example of how you know, how we can think. I mean, I guess that my perspective is, so can we stop trying to say, oh, this is not an essay film because it doesn't have a voiceover, this is not an essay film because it doesn't have this or that, which I'm guilty of myself. I have engaged with that game. But then, you know, I'm thinking with this project of mine, I'm thinking, can we talk about the essay film without asking ourselves the question, is this an essay? And can we talk about what it does and how it does it? So that's where it comes from.
Yes, well, of course, changing the perspective from is it or isn't it to how does it work? It's of course very, very, very interesting, and it seems very productive. And I don't want to be provocative, and I know, imagine that you get this question quite often. But if we think about the essay film in terms of an art of gaps, or thinking about what happens in between images, isn't that very close to what cinema does in general,
yes,
or how cinema works in general?
Completely agree. And again, it's not my ambition to claim this is, you know, this is an essay film because it does this. Actually, the essay film thinks like film thinks. So ultimately, you know, it's a way of thinking about how you, I mean, if we all agree that the essay film ultimately is a film that thinks, and it tries to generate thoughts and thinking, well, then you have your definition. And of course, it's filmic thinking. So yes, it is a project on the essay film, but ultimately it's a project on, you know, how film thinks.
Thanks, Laura. It's a very inspiring and interesting talk, I think, because of the choices of case studies that you made. I'm still trying to work out how these films compare beyond the ethno landscape that you talked about. Sometimes I seem to feel some sort of hierarchy between the films, and the order in which you presented them, it seems to be that they progress from one thing to another, arriving at slower action, which according to you is less mimetic than the other ones. I wasn't sure I totally understood that, because it's entirely figurative, at least in the clips that you showed. So I don't know, whereas Herzog's Fata Morgana tends very much to the abstraction. And very often we really don't know. The last image you showed, an aerial shot of the landscape. It's hard for us to make sense of that image.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many more in the film where it's totally impossible to say exactly what he's shooting.
Yeah.
So I wasn't sure whether there was a judgment of value from one to the other.
Yeah.
How they compare, and your definition of mimesis.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, because it allows me to clarify that point, which I guess, you know, I possibly overemphasized in order to signal what I perceive as a difference in slow action compared to the other two films, but possibly, you know, one ends up overemphasizing and therefore sort of suggesting that there is a big difference between them. I mean, I totally agree that none of the three films ultimately, you know, is, I mean, the three films, each of the three films is constantly breaking, you know, the illusion. And there is a very, very famous sequence in Las Hurdes, which is being written about quite a bit, when you know, the donkey that is thrown, that is thrown from the hills, and you see that it's being shot. And you know, so I'm not, and as you say, the Herzog film is, you know, equally breaks, you know, that sense, you know, the illusion. There are, and increasingly so as the film progresses, to the extent that at some point, you know, it turns into almost a Brechtian. I mean, there are Brechtian scenes in it. So that's not quite the type of difference that I wanted to highlight. I guess what I want to highlight with slow action, so they are all similar and comparable in that sort of anti-mimetic approach. But what I wanted to highlight with slow action is that at this point, the film itself is corrupt. I mean, the film itself is so visibly a film, you know, like material, the celluloid. That there is a kind of a post, you know, that it's even more sort of in the face, you know. So that's the only difference that I wanted to mention, you know, and to highlight. And you're quite right to sort of ask me, you know, to specify that, because I didn't want to absolutely to say that the other two are mimetic. But there is a way in which the other two using, or the sort of the presence of landscape, the photographic presence of landscape as a kind of an authenticity, which of course they undo constantly, you know, whereas slow action with this corruption of the image, it prevents that completely, you know, it's impossible even to play with that. There's no game, you know, with that. Thank you.
perguntas. Podem obviamente fazer aqui à frente. Podem obviamente também fazer as perguntas em português, ou em outra língua qualquer.
Thank you very much for your talk, and I enjoyed it very much. The question I want to ask is in the area of travelogue. It's a genre I worked in a few years ago, and obviously it has its origins in the ethnographic film, which you talked about very well. But was it not already a discredited form by the 1960s? It became sort of hijacked by the tourism industry. Interestingly, you featured Marion C. Cooper, the creator of King Kong. He sat on the board Pan Am.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people who were involved in promoting travelogues were people who had a commercial interest in creating the tourist industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
So by the time we get to the 1960s, that kind of film is totally discredited. It's parodied by Peter Sellers and so on.
Absolutely, and of course, there
When
are.
Herzog made this
Yeah.
film, presumably he had a whole field he could parody straight away.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you're right to say that, of course, I mean, this is not the only type of cinema, the parodies, that sort of form. Absolutely correct, yes. At the same time, I think there is an interesting, that while, the form is, discredited quite early even, as you say, at the same time, film continues to be used or has continued to be used by ethnographers as a kind of a form of recording, even, very self-consciously, of course, but as a form of recording that ultimately is more authentic, than other recordings. So I think that duplicity continues to be in there, and that
National Geographic continues, isn't it?
it continues to be there. So we know it, and we have known it for a while, but it's still there as a cultural discourse, So, thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
It seems to me that all the three films you've just mentioned and that we got to see excerpts of have in common something, which is irony. And irony, it's usually very present in documentaries, but probably not in the ethnographic or of the ethnographic variety.
Yeah.
So that's probably why you chose these three examples instead of others that you could have chosen, because this way, the gap that you mentioned becomes more apparent. There is this expression in Beyond and Hugh, mind the gap.
Yeah.
And these three films keep telling us that mind
The gap.
Mind the gap. We are not doing ethnography,
Yeah.
although it seems that we are working with, the documentary per se. We are not doing a documentary. We are thinking about this. There is an ideological concept behind these films, and we want you to think about it as well.
Yeah.
You could have troubled us more if we had chosen other films, which were more probably documentarian-like.
Yeah.
But I think these three illustrate very well what you mean. But could you perhaps elaborate a little bit more on irony? Because you can have irony on fictional films as well. And
Absolutely.
we are not allowed to call them essay films.
Absolutely. And, again, I kind of, I'm always very conscious that, I don't want my discourse to come across as, this is, an essay, this is what the essay is, so like if you do irony in that way, you're an essay. Of course, you're totally right. I mean, parody, uses irony, in like fiction film uses irony and undermines, constructions, etc. But I like very much what you said about mind the gap, because irony puts a distance, it's like a gap, there suddenly is a distance between what you are, you're looking at and the representation, and is that distance that I'm kind of interested in, is that possibility of, of a detachment, that kind of, generates reflection, and it's precisely in a gap, so thank you for that, very nice mention.
Havia uma pergunta ali atrás, do Toby.
Yes, thank you, Val, for a wonderful talk. I wanted to adopt a pro-ethnographic film position just for the hell of it, and then get
I was hoping in something like that, thank you.
react in whatever way you want, and the same for everybody else. So the first thing would be to say, in terms of these hit jobs that Toby and Roney and Bollinella and all these people do, right, we're used to that, okay, fine, right? But two answers to that. One is that from the very beginning, just like Anual, in even so-called conventional anthropology, there was a very avant-garde sensibility.
Absolutely.
There was a drug-induced sensibility. Yeah. There were a million Nick Tausigs roaming around the world, a century ago. There wasn't actually this supposedly objectifying goal at the heart of the entire project. Yeah. Whilst that certainly existed, and sometimes in the service of imperialism and colonialism, neo-colonialism, right from the beginning of museum ethnology through to the Vietnam War, without a doubt, there were countervailing tendencies that are completely different, anti-realist, anti the idea of absolute mimesis and so on. Yeah. So that's the first thing I thought was worth noting. And then the second thing would be to say that in terms of what could be regarded as the conventional empiricist ethnographic film, that is denounced and understandably so, they performed sometimes a very different function from the one that is accorded to them by critics. Yeah. And that function was a kind of universal humanism, which for all its lack of fashionability, theoretically and politically, may well have had all kinds of influences that are much more complicated than the ones that those of us who are anti-realist or anti-naturalist assume. I'm thinking of a long review essay that Stephen Greenblatt wrote in the New Yorker 20 years ago, when a book came out called Reading National Geographic. The gentleman mentioned National Geographic. We're all used to Discovery Channel, TLC, National Geo, all these forms. It's very easy to make fun of them and mock them from a high intellectual perspective. For lots of very ordinary people, they're a means of seeing the other in a way that isn't just objectifying, might be respectful, and might even open up perspectives. And that was the argument Greenblatt made, for example, about his own subjectivity as a child reading National Geographic magazine. So I just wondered if you could respond to those 2 points.
Absolutely.
One about the anti-realist aesthetic at the heart of anthropology from its very beginnings, it's never gone away, and the other, the claim that there might be something about conventional ethnographic film and its impact that's much more complicated politically than the hit job critics of the last 2.5 decades will allow.
Yeah. Again, absolutely. I mean, like when I started to define what I meant with ethnographic film, I instantly said not the more experimental vein, because I mean, there is a lot of experimental ethnography, and even within not, overtly experimentalist ethnography, there are, of course, self-conscious, as well, films, So, again, I absolutely don't mean, this is not meant as an attack on ethnography as a whole, or, but I guess more on a certain gaze. Which is a trope, and it's a cultural trope, which is of course associated with ethnography, but not exclusively. And so I guess the object of critique is not so much ethnography as a science, or as or even ethnographic film, as an object of. But more, a certain gaze, which produces a certain landscape, a certain framing of things, etc., and that can then be reproduced in a million different forms. So yeah, absolutely. I really didn't mean to sort of put everything into a pause, but to talk about that and acknowledging. The amazing, experimental ethnographic work that has been done, which is such a treasure of documentary cinema and of cinema tout court. So absolutely that. The second question is more about how we can look at these films in ways that don't necessarily typify them according to that, and sort of that. Bring out other perspectives. I mean, again, I think your totally correct. There is a tendency to instantly, sort of critique certain things, from a point of view which almost, it's so automatic even, it's become such an automatic way, which of course is based on, something pre-evident, self-evident. I mean, there is a need, to look at racialized representation, and where these things come from and how they are connoted, etc. But then we risk, obviously, losing sight of other points of view. Absolutely. I mean, one of the works now is not exactly what you have mentioned, which is very interesting, but there is some work that has been done more recently in looking at early ethnography as a vehicle to rethink, so not so much, with the lenses of, sort of, the post-colonialist lenses on, or not exclusively with those on, but actually to look at how they end up, even sometimes by mistake, representing realities and things that are extremely valuable, from different perspectives. So again, absolutely, and this paper is not an attack on ethnography. It's more, a way of trying to think about regimes of vision and, ways of problematizing those. So thank you, Tom.
Mais alguma pergunta e comentário? Não? Luís Mendonça, a sério, não? Vou lançar.
I think people want coffee.
Bom, então encerramos aqui esta primeira conferência plenária. Existe